Good morning. And happy 4th of July week, in case you didn't know, with all the wonderful music. I am so grateful for our great nation, maybe more than I ever have been before. I've been in France, the Czech Republic, and New York City for most of the month of June. I flew into New Orleans on a couple of Saturdays late to be with you on Sunday, and then I flew right back out after the service. I had a wonderful and inspiring and fascinating time, but I am more thankful than I ever have been for these United States of America and for the gifts of freedom that it has given us. Outside freedom in terms of the land and certain inalienable rights that we all have, and inner freedom, which gives us freedom of religion and the right to think and to believe and to practice however we want. This freedom allows our Unity Spirituality Center here to openly function, for example. I think some of us might have been crucified or burned at the stake 150 or 200 years ago, actually. I'm pretty sure of it. We are allowed total outer and inner freedom in the United States, and this is one of the most precious gifts that can be bestowed upon us, and a very rare one in the history of the world, and unfortunately one which I think sometimes we all take for granted. I know I do sometimes. I actually wanted to entitle this truth lesson, Paris, Provence, Prague, Prayer, Praise, Plains, and Perfection. But I was afraid nobody would come. I figured that among other things, you'd think that you had to endure perhaps 250 travel photos up on some screen today. But now that you're here, I do have some observations about what I've seen that are tantamount to what we're going to talk about today on this 4th of July week. I left for Paris with my French students right after the Sunday service here on June 2nd. I hope my students learned a lot of French in France during their homestay program in Paris, but I think I learned the most on this trip. One thing I learned or relearned is that it's hard to meditate and write truth lessons on a trip with a bunch of adolescents. My comment to myself about that, of course, was that all life needs to be a meditation, and that there are no perfect or rarely perfect circumstances or perfect people around in life that make practicing our spiritual path ideal. It just never happens. The truth is that part of our growth is to learn to transcend and transmute any situation or anybody's stuff. It's all grist for the mill, as we talk about in here a lot. It's easy to go meditate and practice being holy in some quiet cave in the Himalayan mountains, but all the distractions and all of the people, as soon as you go down to the marketplace, they're jostling you around, requires a lot of inner work. There's a story about that, about the yogi who went for years up into the Himalaya mountains into a cave. Maybe some of you have heard of it. And he felt so together and so enlightened and so holy. And finally, he had to go down to the marketplace to get something at one point when he thought he was done. And the first time somebody elbowed him and shoved him out of the way, he lost it and started cursing the man and realized he hadn't gotten anywhere. So we need all these outward distractions and these people and their stuff, because that kind of helps us see where we are. Remember the lotus? The symbol of the lotus in Buddhism, that lovely lotus flower that blooms in all its perfection at the top of the swamp water? But remember that the lotus gains all its sustenance from its stem, which is rooted at the bottom of the filthy swamp. There's not much down there but mud and dead fish debris and garbage. But the lotus uses it all to transform itself and to nourish itself. And then it blooms into this beautiful plant on the top of the swamp. All life can be used to grow. Wherever we are, whatever we're doing, whomever we are with, is the perfect situation for growing spiritually. I became aware of how often I was uncomfortable when things didn't go and people didn't act like I was programmed to think they should. So I had to practice a lot of so that's the way reality is. So that's the way some people are when such and such is the case. And traveling internationally anywhere these days is full of opportunities to practice patience, compassion, and deep understanding. Noise, crying babies, long lines, millions of people, and hundreds of languages and technology to deal with everywhere. Oh my gosh, no two credit card machines work the same way. No two airplane reservations or train or subway tickets work in the same way. Few hotel room doors open the same way, and absolutely no toilet in all of Europe flushes the same way. One is constantly dealing with people and traffic and gadgets and foreign languages. It was a wonderful opportunity to grow. In Paris, I felt overwhelming gratitude for our Unity Center here. The destruction by fire of most of Notre Dame Cathedral made me realize how very fortunate we are to have this beautiful building to meet in. We must never take any luxury like this for granted. And our spiritual lives are strong here. You can't imagine how much of a vacuum many Europeans have in their spiritual lives right now. Most have lost faith in traditional Christianity, but they don't know about any other way. Like Unity, for example. The dogma, the rituals, and the church's belief in some anthropomorphic and sometimes vengeful white male God completely turn them away from their Catholic heritage. But they've never, most of them, encountered anything else. I was really kind of surprised. I kept looking for Unity churches. And much of what those people have rejected wasn't even originally in the original teachings of Jesus. It was added later for political or economic reasons. I honestly feel that if unity-type ideas were accessible in Europe, there would be a lot more believers. What most of them have rejected was never a part of our teachings here at Unity and other New Thought groups. In fact, when I saw the remains of the badly burned Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, I sat there looking at this, what was such a magnificent cathedral. I couldn't help but think that it was the physical symbol of a people whose spiritual essence was no longer intact. You know, about 85% of the French will tell you, I'm Catholic, but non pratiquant, non-practicing. And the fact that so many French were truly crushed by this made me think that they somehow wanted to be spiritually whole again. I couldn't help but think that they could be much more spiritually engaged if more of them had access to teachings like we have here at Unity, which would be much more in line with their intellectual wavelength. Again, we are very, very fortunate in this country for having freedom of religion now and for the past 250 years. Traditional Catholicism and Protestantism have not been the only game in town in our country. It kind of has been a lot in Europe, and I think that is what's happened to many of those people, what they've lost. We also took the students to the Normandy beaches in France. It was the 75th anniversary of the D-Day invasion, And we had about 15 D-Day veterans on the plane going to France. Some had not been back since the D-Day invasion. They were so adorable. They were between 93 and 104 years old. And the people in the airport, when they announced who they were all just continually clapping and thanking them for everything they had done, and all the way over. Every time someone got up in the aisle and went by, they would thank them. I heard several of the veterans say they were very grateful that they could help us. Imagine that fateful D-Day invasion when hundreds of thousands of men landed on the Normandy beaches in the early morning, being shot at endlessly and unmercifully by the myriad German bunkers, some of which we saw up on the hill. I don't know how any of them made it. Very few American soldiers did, but the ones who did kept Hitler from taking over a good part of the Western world. For that, too, I became more grateful than ever for this great country. After seeing and talking with those veterans and seeing the films in the museums of how unmercifully those young boys were annihilated that day, I will never again on the 4th of July fail to be grateful to those people and to all Americans who have defended this country and died for our country and died for our freedom and fought for it so hard. Freedom is very easy to lose, as everyone I talked with in the Czech Republic testified to. By the way, before I go on, I want to tell you that the 104-year-old D-Day veteran said he still mows his lawn every week. Can you imagine? They were so cute. Anyway, after France, we went to Prague. The city and all of the Czech Republic that I saw was absolutely beautiful, and the 16th century architecture was stunning beyond words. It really lives up to its reputation of being the new Paris. But again, I quickly realized how grateful we should all be that we have not had to endure what the Czechoslovakians did for a half a century. They were first occupied by the Nazis during World War II. A part of their population, the Jews, were virtually decimated in the concentration camps by the Nazis. And then after that, they were ruled by the communists until 1989. So for 50 years, the Czechs lost their land, their businesses, and their freedom. The government took everything. Can you imagine America being controlled by outside forces for 50 years? I mean, those poor people, first the Czechs have to learn German to really survive well, then they have to learn Russian to really survive well, and in the meantime, everything's taken away from them. I felt so very grateful for the freedom that we now have and have always enjoyed in America. That whole experience made me proud and grateful to be an American, and it reminded me of what we stand for in this country, e pluribus unum, out of many one. Americans of every race and creed and former nationality on the plane and in the airport were wildly applauding together in gratitude and for those old veterans returning to Normandy. We were all grateful and we were all one, sort of a symbol of what we've become, and we forget that a lot. May July 4th remind us of that this year. After Paris, Provence, and Prague, I went to New York City last week, spent the week there at a World Religion Conference, and I saw the Broadway hit Hamilton. It's a rap musical about the founding of our country. Have any of you all seen Hamilton yet? It's about the life of Alexander Hamilton. During the play, I was even more struck with gratitude for all that we have inherited in our country. We often take democracy and freedom of religion and just freedom in general for granted, but people like Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, spoke up for freedom from the tyranny of England's monarchy and social persecution. They risked death at first for tyranny because they spoke up against King George III. There was no freedom of speech in the colony at that time. Later, of course, many Americans did die when it all turned into war against England, which had the most powerful navy in the world at that time. I still can't believe we won, and if it hadn't been for France, of course, we would not have. Being in New York City made me especially thankful for the unity of our country. Virtually no one speaks English in New York. Some 900 different nationalities, religions, and ethnic groups are living and traveling through there at all times. And somehow it all works. Talk about unity. I was overwhelmed at the unity and cooperation that was evident there. All the way from the airport, I kept seeing all these signs, e pluribus unum, out of the one many. And I realized how true it is in our great nation. America is a living, breathing unity of all life in action. So for many reasons, after this month of travel, I am grateful more than ever for unity here, for America, and for our freedom. Things aren't perfect in New Orleans, and they aren't perfect in America. This has been, and always will be the case. But we have so much to be thankful for. We aren't occupied by another country. No one is exterminating big factions of our population. We aren't starving under a tyrannical king. We are free to pursue our spiritual lives in any way we see fit. And we are free to pursue our dreams here. Bottom line, we are free inside and we are free outside due to the efforts of many, many people who have come before us. We aren't occupied by forces like the Nazis and communists, and we don't have torture chambers for non-believers in the basement of Catholic abbeys, like was the case in the Middle Ages in Mont Saint-Michel in France, which we visited. We don't have Nazis killing us because of our religion, like they did the Jews, and we don't have European governments forcing us to change our religion sometimes every week, which was the case in Elizabethan England. You woke up one day and you had to be Anglican, and if you didn't convert, you lost everything you owned. And a week later, you had to be Catholic, or the same thing would happen. So this July 4th, let us be grateful for many, many things. I hope you all think about the American dream, that of freedom and democracy, which people have dreamed since ancient times, and which we have carved out of virtually nothing in this country. We didn't just tweak another system that was already in place, like the French did. The democratic dreams of the ancients became a reality in this great land by having a dream and by constructing it from nothing and then by fighting for it. It isn't perfect, we all know that, because human nature isn't perfect yet. That's what's necessary in a democracy, but it is amazing. The Egyptians, the Greeks, and later many European people of wisdom all believed in the democratic ideal, but they never could find a place to put it into effect. But in America, for the first time, the idea took form. It has been fought for, it has been protected, and maintained for 250 years. Many say that secret societies throughout the ages have guarded this democratic ideal for over 3,000 years, waiting for the time and the place where it could finally manifest. Whatever its history, it did take form in America. and the democratic ideal lives here. This democratic ideal means, though, that we all have the responsibility to live up to the ideals of this country in order for them to survive. We must educate ourselves so that we can understand the system, and we must be noble and wise beings in order to vote and to live responsibly and to live as one. We must ensure that this country survives. It's up to us now. We may not be those World War II veterans that went to Normandy Beach, but it's our responsibility now to fight for it. It is our responsibility as part of the voting process to be the highest beings that we can be. This was the most noble idea ever conceived. This is how democracy will survive, when everyone lives up to the spiritual and ethical values that are involved. We must accept each other, all of us, as one. We are all in it together, and we must do what we can to make it work. We are now the soldiers. Onward, Christian soldiers, or remember that song, maybe some of you. Well, we are spiritual soldiers. We need to fight for this. We must all do whatever we can to make it work. As John Kennedy said, ask not what you can do for your country, but ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Those adorable 90 and 100-year-old D-Day veterans who rode over on the plane with us really set the example. We may not ever be able to fully repay them, but we can certainly work on ourselves in terms of being good, honest, compassionate, giving, educated humans who continue to contribute to the process and to the well-being of others. We owe it to those World War II veterans. We owe it to Alexander Hamilton and George Washington and millions of others who have fought for these noble utopian ideas and implemented them into an actual time and place with a functioning government. For thousands of years, this was just a dream to the Egyptians and the Greeks and the Romans. Now it is our reality. We all, of course, have our own ideas about politics and how to best run this government. But one thing we must agree on is to think about how we can be and how we can do on the highest level, whatever we conceive of that as being. How can we uphold the vision that this country was founded on? How can we be the kind of people that a democracy needs to work? As not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. There will always be those who try to beat the system, use the system, selfishly take from it without giving anything. There will always be those who break the very laws that the people themselves decide on. And there will always be those who just aren't aware of how fragile a democratic system can be. But let's do our part to help uphold this democratic system and set the example. Let's do our part to help young people realize that it is fragile and must be defended in many ways, mostly by our all being good citizens. Otherwise, we could lose it, like the Europeans did in many countries. Just remember, it wasn't very long ago that Paris was occupied by the Nazis for about 4 years. Prague was occupied by the Nazis and then the communists for 45 years. Many countries would like to occupy our land and usurp our freedom and opportunity and businesses, etc. We must be ever vigilant and not just leave it up to the government and the armed forces to keep our nation strong. We must be strong and upright and grateful for our liberty and work to make of ourselves the kind of people who can uphold that freedom and help others, educate others, especially the young, along those lines. And don't forget the great responsibility we have to constantly work on our inner freedom, too. Others have given us our outer freedom that we are celebrating this week, but only we can work on maintaining our inner freedom, getting free of prejudice, hatred, societal values like consumerism, materialism, using others as objects just to be consumed and used instead of as human beings to be respected and loved. And we should be grateful that at Unity, we have tools that help us gain this inner freedom from some of this negativity and some of this programming that can cause us to be enslaved inwardly. Like we were talking about in the Sunday school class today downstairs. There's a lot of craziness out there, mass psychosis, the French call it. We've got to watch all that programming to get really free. Let's imagine that one of those tools we use to maintain our inner freedom is a hammer that can shatter the tendency we have to accept things like unforgiveness and negativity within ourselves. That's perhaps the war that our generation can wage. It's an inner war. Bottom line, let's go through the week being thankful that we live in a free country. Let's go through the week and celebrate the 4th of July being more grateful than ever for our democracy. Let's be grateful for the brave men and women who gave it to us throughout history. And let's be thankful that we know how to get free of all kinds of negativity that can bring our personal country down, ourselves, as well as our country of America. Let's be thankful this July 4th that the New World Order that our forefathers brought to this country is possible within us and on the physical plane. A new world order. Think about it. Something that people dreamed of for 3,000 years. Now, let us have the courage to wage war against the thoughts that cause us and those around us any kind of suffering. Let us continue to protect and support what for thousands of years people like Plato called the ultimate utopian society. That's us. That's what we have right now. May the fireworks go off in our minds this July 4th and wake us up to our good fortune and to our responsibility to preserve this democratic system where in God we trust. Our nation was founded on that. I think some nations are losing it, and I think some nations are losing. In God we trust. Jesus said, "Know the truth, and the truth shall set ye free." The truth is and always will be that there is a oneness of all life that America represents, and that there are eternal values and laws which we must all abide by in order to maintain a truly great society. Yes, think not what your country can do for you. It's already done it for us, but what we can do for our country. You can start this July 4th by being grateful and thanking God for your good fortune, and think about some of these eternal values that our great country was founded on. These are inner values. They are what make our nation great, and they are what make the individuals in it great. Caring for others, living in unity, honesty, integrity, and a willingness to give back to give to others, to help others. And especially remember, in God we trust. Amen.